So I'll go on to poster structure and design. Um, so I guess the context is that at this conference, there's going to be a combination of technical and clinical researchers in the field of mechanical circulatory support. Um, they haven't officially released the guidelines for this year's posters, but most conferences generally are portrait orientation A0 posters, so I'm going along with that assumption. And um, from past years, typically the poster session has up to 50 posters. And the situation is that you are presenting your poster in a room that is filled with lots and lots of posters, with an audience that is kind of overwhelmed with too many posters. And the audience is jet lagged if they've traveled quite far away and only really has a few minutes to spend on scanning posters and only picking a subset to view. And therefore, with that perspective, you would want to make your posters easily noticeable and digestible. But if we talk about the key aims, the idea is not to present everything that you have done, because having a big wall of text makes it a high barrier for someone to interact with the poster. It means that it's almost impossible to read, and if there's someone standing next to there, that the most common thing would be you would just go to the person to talk to about your poster rather than actually absorbing any information from the poster. Um, but one thing to it is a networking tool. So the aim is that you want to start a conversation and attract attention. So you want to convey enough information that people know the context and the work, but then you're there already. So then any questions that they have or further details is through a conversation. But it is also a communication tool in two different ways. One is that it should be standalone, as in contain all the information that is um, able for someone to digest without having to talk to you. And in that sense, you're aiming more for it to be kind of an abstract. So having a similar word count to that, not going really into more detail, but it's minimal text with lots of figures, highlighting the broad strokes of what you've done and the key results. But similarly, because people then will want to ask you questions, or they may just go straight to you and go, um, so tell me about your work or poster, is that it should also be useful for you as a visual aid while you are either answering questions or giving a couple minute overview of your work to people. Um, Another thing is that I think potentially many teams are hoping to receive further advice or collaborations or maybe funding or increasing your following in social media. So it's good to know to have a call to action within your poster. Um, there's a researcher that summarized in their words the key objectives of things that you would want to avoid here, which is minimize cognitive load is the idea of that you want it to be very easily digestible. Researchers in a conference are very time poor and already overloaded, so you want to make this very simple. You want to make it minimal interaction costs, so there is very little barriers in interpreting the information, and then when communicating with you, you using it as a presentation aid. This idea of maximizing information sent is the idea is that a lot of people will just read the title and then judge based on the title whether they want to read the poster or any further. And therefore, having a title that clearly explains what you did or the key outcome, or if there is a big noticeable figure or key single sentence or two highlighting what is your key outcomes that someone can straight away see, will then get through the next barrier of, oh, I want to talk to this group or I want to read the rest of the poster. And then to get attention in this conversation, is you want to have nice designs or something unique in your poster. So in this aim of trying to be a networking communication tool, this idea of being graphical abstract is the like abstracts is you want to have very minimal text, potentially up to 120 words. But this time, people are only skim reading it. So you really want to use dot points, and where there is key points that you want someone to notice, to use bold or accent colors. And in relation to this, you want to avoid two things. So one is overly technical lingo depending on your audience. So in my research, I do neonatal health monitoring, which means the first month of life. However, when I make posters or papers in engineering conferences, I tend to avoid the word neonatal because that's not really a common term, and I switch to newborn in my presentations. Whereas if I'm presenting at like a hospital or a pediatric conference, I would then be fine using the term neonatal as that is quite commonly used. You also want to avoid unknown acronyms to the community that you're presenting to. So, for instance, at least within my club, there is the Student Activities Committee, which we use the term SAC very commonly, but no one else knows that acronym. So you'd want to avoid it. Even if you do define acronyms in your poster, you need to remember that if someone is skim reading your poster, they might be default going to only particular sections of your poster. Therefore, if you defined your acronym in the introduction section, and then you use that acronym in the methods, potentially someone has just jumped to reading the methods, and therefore don't know what that acronym means and has to look back up at the introduction. So you might want to consider that and try to make each section a bit standalone. Um, but in relation to minimizing cognitive load and being an abstract, there's this quote here, which is that you want to provide the minimal amount of information that conveys the most amount of information that you want, or the key takeaways. Um, because if there is too much information, it has a high barrier for someone to want to interact either with you or with the poster. You want to just highlight key points. And then as a conversation starter, if they want to learn more, they would then talk to you. So in terms of sections, it's very similar to a paper of intro, methods, results, conclusions, references, and call to action. And just briefly going over them sections. So in the introduction, it might be considered a mini abstract in itself, but you might want to convey the context of the situation, the particular problem you're trying to solve, the aim or the key outcome of the work that you've done. So nice overview. It's a quick thing. And in wanting to make it potentially more visual or pleasing, you could consider a graphical abstract, so something which is a series of images that briefly explains the key problem and what you're doing, or a flow chart, or integrating icons into it. For methods and results, depending on the structure of your poster, you might be merging them together, or they might be two standalone sections. At least based on what we think the abstracts were submitted on, at least these would be the sort of sections you might want to include, whether it's the design requirements you did or the particular design, or your computer simulations or mock circulation loop. Or potentially, if you're going less scientific, you might want to be presenting your overall Heart Hackathon project, and therefore there would be a commercialization section within your poster. Conclusion is just highlighting the key results and potential future work. So call to action is a very simple thing to do, which is just provide a QR code that is quite noticeable within your poster. And this is very important because your poster doesn't provide everything. And therefore, the QR code is either providing further information for them to learn more or to get involved or follow you as well. So it's very useful to include a QR code, for instance, using a link tree that highlights all the key links that you want to share with researchers. For instance, they might be very interested in your poster, but not have enough time, and the QR code is a quick scan, and maybe in that QR code, you have a PDF version of your poster there for them to also look over again. In terms of figures, you don't want a lot of them because you would want only a few with clear standalone figure captions because potentially people will just straight up look at figures without reading the rest of your poster. And the in-text of your figures and tables you will need to make sufficiently large, the similar size fonts to the rest of your poster if someone is to read it from a couple of meters away. Um, and then more just a nice graphical design tip is to have a color scheme that matches nicely with the poster's color scheme in itself. Yeah. So I just wanted to give a couple of examples to highlight components, but not necessarily the best of things, is when doing figures and plots, it can be nice to have potential redundancy or a color coding system. For instance, here, logistic regression is the dashed lines of a pattern, whereas these two conditions, one's HI and one is acidosis, and they're color coded as red and blue. Um, or you might want to code both a pattern and color or a shading, as in dark red or light red, and have several redundancies in it so that if someone is viewing this and they're colorblind, that there's a pattern that they can distinguish themselves, or it's a grayscale variation things. You may want to potentially convey information. This is just an example, not necessarily the best way of doing it, where um, this is from a paper, so not the poster version, but a way of conveying the magnitude of a particular value is using a gradient, which is an additional piece of information instead of having to read the actual numbers within the plots. So having additional redundancy of either considering shading, patterns, or colors, or numbers and duplicating that makes it easier for different people to be able to interpret your figures. So these two links are just a dictionary or repository of ways that you can convey through different tables and figures information. So it's a nice resource to have if you're trying to figure out what is the best form of a figure to convey certain information. So in terms of layout, I guess general layouts that you could do is these three, where you kind of have a little flow chart of your introduction and aim. You then have your methods and results, and then your conclusion with a QR code. Or you might consider it as purely a two-column sort of poster and therefore arrange your sections like that, or a one-column poster and arrange it. And then within them sorts of sections, um, potentially instead of having methods and results as single distinct sections, potentially it's more that you have two different method sections. So for instance, you might want to be showing the results of your simulations. So this whole section to the left is going to be methods one simulations and with the key results, whereas methods two is mock circulation results. Or it might be instead that you put all your methods in the left panel, and the right panel is just the key results to show. Or depending on if you have more sections, you could break it up into a 3-panel situation. Similarly, with other formats, you might want to have methods, and then results is largely just nice figures to interpret. Or you have methods and below is results, or within each method section, you would have a panel on the right showing the key results. And an important thing to note is when considering these layouts is that you want to have a decent amount of negative space. So unlike these figures here, is equal spacing between all sections and a nice border, because it makes it a lot easier. Because if it is all jam-packed, it makes it very hard to read easily. Yeah. So in terms of color, less is more. So the idea is that you'd only really want to be picking a color theme that is a couple of colors. So you would have really just one main color, a dark version of that color, an accent color. And there's resources here where this one just shows you how to make a palette where you just input 2 colors, and that is your primary color and an accent color, and it defines that is how you all your colors that you use in your poster. Another useful resource to consider is color contrast. So there is a website here that just calculates the color contrast between your text and your background, and if it's sufficient to be able to read depending on how far away you are. In terms of text, key thing to remember is to use non-serif or sans serif font. The difference is that serif fonts, as shown in this figure, have these little embellishments, which when reading a poster takes a lot more effort to read. Whereas sans serif is just a simple uniform um, thickness font. And usually the default fonts within Word or PowerPoint are sans serif fonts. And you want to be using them for readability. And then some recommendations of the sorts of fonts and sizes that you would want are here are some general recommendations for A0. But if you're thinking about how far away people are standing, then these are the sort of minimal fonts that are readable at particular distances. Yeah. So to finalize your poster, a good thing to do is if you've set it up right on PowerPoint, Canva, or whichever software you're using as the particular A0 size, then you can quickly view it at 100 times. You won't be able to see the full poster, but you'll be able to see sections of the poster and then stand at the distance that you would expect your audience to be reading from to see if the fonts are suitable. It's also good to print a dummy version on an A4 piece of paper, kind of just seeing what does the overall layout look like and if the spacing and if there's any issues. And then depending on the software you're using, if you're using Canva, you can actually pick the color scheme that you are exporting to, where if you are like uploading the poster online, then you'd use standard RGB because the way that phones and computers screens code and present information is through RGB LEDs. Whereas if you have the option, you can export to CMYK, which is the color scheme that printers use to actually print the poster. And because these posters are going to be very, very large, you want to make sure that one, that it's a PDF version that you've saved, not a PNG, and that all your images have sufficient resolution. So this is 300 pixels per inch is a good thing to aim for an A0 poster. Yeah. So just going over some examples, these are not necessarily the best of examples. I was just going to highlight some ideas and things to think about. Um, so for instance, this poster here has a very simple color palette as shown, where there is really only one defining color. And this color is used quite well as a emphasis of accent text. It has quite minimal um, words and quite a lot of negative space, which is quite nice. Um, it may or may not be a good thing, but I quite like that it has an eye-catching main graphic, which, depending on your context, is a nice way of clearly conveying what your key research is before people actually read it. Something I do not like as well, they have made their figures consistent with the color scheme. Because it's orange on orange, the color contrast is not the best there. But this was something that I quite liked. Oh, and also their headings are um, the wrong orientation, which makes it harder to read quickly. So I copied this sort of idea for a poster for one of the conference I presented at. And to give context, the conference I was presenting at was a engineering or technical conference that was on just generally cardiology. So my eye-catching graphic was a pregnant woman because my research is on fetal monitoring. And this is a nice way of clearly conveying, and all the people that came to my poster were people working on fetal newborn health. Obviously, having an image of a pregnant woman in a conference that is just about pregnancy would be useless. But in my particular conference, very few people are doing fetal work. So this is just a quick way of getting people that are interested. I then copied the similar accents of the orange to make things better, and integrated it within my figures to highlight orange as like the bad class in my figures. And something else was the QR code. So I had key contact details in this QR code linked to my full paper. Some other posters that I've made that represent another layout that I showed, this like three-panel layout, where I had broadly three key areas of research. So you, for instance, might want to talk about the design of your heart, and then the next one would be on simulation results, and then the third panel could be mock circulation results. And the idea was that you briefly explain the methods and then have figures or key figure or flowchart explaining the methods, and then underneath the key results in it. Um, Here is like potentially, but you might be concerned about IP. If you want to highlight key components, this was an example of explaining in my work a digital stethoscope where we had a key figure and then highlighted the innovative components of it as well. Yeah. Some ones that I thought were interesting was so this example of a poster is highlighting the usefulness of having a graphical abstract, where even though scientific conferences are considered very formal, having something that is a bit more fun and eye-catching can engage people to initially interact with your poster and then with you. So having something that, while the rest of the poster is a standard poster that has the full information, this single flow chart conveys the problem, context, and solution clearly and catches people's eyes. Some other ones, which is having a key central figure. So, for instance, here, this work is on crabs, or back during my master's, our poster that we designed was centered such that you would have the company name, the key work, and a mock-up of the device. as well. And something potentially useful here is in this one, this might be at least there's insufficient information compared to scientific posters, but this highlights kind of the more style of how Heart Hackathon is evaluated, where you highlight your core problem, your overall idea of the solution, kind of the outcome of it, and then the commercialization that is relevant. And that this was something that people could read a few meters away, and at least in our context, which was a bit different, was we had a mini booth presenting this. So it was a large poster just to get people to come to the booth. And then we had full PowerPoint presentations and several presenters as well. So something a bit different. So several years ago, there was this movement called the Better Poster, which was polarizing, but I like some of the ideas that they present. So they had this poster design, the landscape version on the left and portrait version on the right, where that your poster should be more like a billboard, because most people that are at a poster session will only spend a few seconds looking at each poster to determine whether to interact with it or not. So they thought that the majority of the section of your poster should actually just be uh, a single sentence or two that highlights the key findings, so that even if they don't interact anymore with your poster, they have learned something. And then they've integrated as there's a key finding and one key figure that is interpretable by itself. They then suggested having these left and right panels, where the idea was that the right panel was called this ammo bar, where the idea is that if you are standing to the right of your poster, then someone would see the main finding, a key figure, and then want to interact with you. And that this ammo bar was just a series of graphs. They don't need to be explainable by themselves. The idea was it's as this view of a poster is a presentation aid, is that you would be answering questions or presenting now to them, and that these would be the key figures that you would want to point to while presenting. Whereas this panel on the left was this idea called the silent presenter, where the idea is that if you are standing to the right and already interacting with someone, that someone that therefore is waiting to ask you questions could just view what is more like a standard poster, but in mini format. So it would have the key background methods and results, which they would have only interacted with based on seeing the key central part. So this better poster movement had a couple of variations which are interesting that potentially aren't worth completely replicating, but the ideas are useful. So one was that they did a study on this where a lot of people actually implemented this poster design in conferences, and they found out that this ammo bar was quite uh, useless or not used that often, and that having a key central figure is very important. So they had this thing called the figure hero design, which is you have this key outcome that you want to tell people, one key figure, and then you have this mini poster on the left. So the idea is that someone would interact initially with your poster by seeing this key summary and figure, which is the way to attract attention. And then if they want to learn more, there is this section here that they'll read, which does make sense because a lot of people, when reading posters, will purely just read the title and judge based on the title whether they want to interact with it. So dedicating potentially a larger section to not just a title that says what you did, but actually what was achieved, and having a key figure is utilizing, trying to have a higher conversion of people to actually interact with you further. Another one is a more dedicated presenter one. So this left is how people would initially read the key information. And then these figures here are not necessarily standalone, but it's like a mini PowerPoint where you have these three key figures that you would then talk through if someone actually wanted to engage with your poster. And then finally, this is from Animate Your Science, which is summarizing how you should make a poster and exemplifying it within a poster where they have only uh, blue or turquoise as their key color, yellow as their accent color, aiming for minimal text that is in dot points, that you have a key figure or something that represents either the research that you do, that is, especially if it is something different to the conference, it's a good way of already engaging with the audience that wants to interact with you, or highlighting a key figure of results that is interpretable purely upon looking at it. Um, and that's about it for that section. So, um, some useful references or resources. So if you want to use free icons, there is this website here. This website has a whole series of different websites that have free resources for medical related images. Um, there is this company called BioRender. It does, I believe, cost money depending on which figures you use, but it's very commonly used to make biomedical related figures and images. Um, and then the resources that I used to make this presentation was Animate Your Science, and Mike Morrison was the person that started the Better Poster movement, which he has a series of YouTube videos that are quite interesting in talking about the presenter and attendee experience, which is very important because in the end, your poster can be very different from what I presented, but the idea is that you want to know who your audience is and what their situation is, and what is the key information that you actually want people to take away. And knowing that context is important in designing a particular post that you want to do. Whoops. In terms of presentations, so besides the finals presentation you'll do the day before the conference, which is 15-minute presentation, 5 minutes Q&A, the most common sort of presentations that you'll be giving throughout the conference is either in purely networking when someone asks you, so what are you doing? And usually when someone's asking you that, they're only really expecting a less than 30-second explanation of what you're doing. And if they are interested further, then they would ask you questions. Whereas with a poster, the situation is either they could quickly absorb the poster and are coming to you to ask you particular questions. So the idea is this poster is a simple abstract, or some people may not want to engage fully with the poster. They just read the title and therefore they come to you as, so tell me about your poster. And usually that interaction is a couple of minutes. It's a quick overview, kind of like a 3-minute thesis or 3-minute poster summary. And if there is questions, then that is where the conversation becomes longer. So the idea, similar to a poster, is in presenting these pictures or posters, you want the language to be accessible and simple. While the research or what you've done is complicated, the language that you use or jargon, you shouldn't need to sound smart when explaining it. It should be not exactly dumbed down, but very easy to explain, and avoiding highly technical terms. Now, obviously, in ISMTS, there's a particular context that everyone is doing mechanical circulatory support. So therefore, there is a certain baseline level of knowledge that you can assume, but it is important to do that. And when making presentations, it is very good to uh, have an idea or practice this 30-second kind of pitch or 3-minute presentation, but you don't want to have it memorized in the sense of it's not you presenting to a large audience or a lecture theater. It's a conversation. So in that sense, you want to have a sample script that you practice, but then you only really want to boil it down to a couple of key points or key takeaways. And that's what you want to remember when presenting to them. Because in the end, it's a short presentation kind of, but it then leads to further questions. So it is conversational. In terms of your poster, it's a 2, 3 minute summary of whatever sections you presented in your poster. Whereas in a 30-second pitch, some content that you could include is quickly who you are. So you are representing whichever university student team, that the key problem that you're addressing, the sort of novelty in your solution, and then like what you have actually achieved. So solution is the long-term work that you're doing. You may have not completely finished it, but what if you then achieved? And that is something you can quickly convey in 30 seconds. And depending on what they're interested in, they would ask you. In a pitch, it's a lot less on how you did something. Usually people are asking what you did. So you're going in broad strokes. And if they're interested in something in particular of what you did or how you did it, they would ask you a question. And that's the idea of these posters, pitches, and presentations, is that these are all just initial conversation starters to convey the overall project so that people will want to engage further and ask questions. It's not presenting everything that you did to begin with.